All right, let's go. Number 10. Sanxingdui. In the summer of 1986, workers digging clay for a brickyard near the village of Sanxingdui in China's Sichuan province broke through into a rectangular pit. Inside was a mass of bronze, jade, gold, and elephant ivory. A second pit turned up a few weeks later, on the 14th of August, only 20 or 30 meters from the first. Between them, they held more than 900 objects, and almost nothing about them looked like the rest of ancient China. The bronzes date to the late Shang period, around 3,200 years ago. Those are the same centuries when the Shang kings on the Yellow River, hundreds of miles to the northeast, were casting their famous ritual vessels. But the Shang made cups and cauldrons. Sanxingdui made faces, huge bronze heads with sharp jaws and narrow eyes. A standing figure about 2.5 meters tall, its hands curled around something that is no longer there. A bronze tree close to 4 meters high, and one mask more than a meter wide, its eyes pushed forward out of the sockets on stalks 16 centimeters long, as if the thing were straining to see something the rest of us cannot. None of this had simply been laid in the ground. It had been broken first, burned. The metal was smashed and scorched, then buried in careful layers, ivory near the top, bronze in the middle, smaller pieces at the bottom. Whoever did this destroyed a fortune on purpose, put it to the fire, and covered it over. The city itself was enormous for its time. It covered roughly 12 square kilometers, ringed by earthen walls about 40 meters thick at the base. This was not a village. It was a capital. Except, the pits were not tombs. There were no bodies, no coffins, no names. Just the smashed, scorched treasure of a kingdom, broken on purpose and buried in careful layers by people who left no explanation, because they left no writing at all. That silence is the disturbing part. Shang sites from the same period are covered in an early Chinese script, scratched into ox bones and turtle shells. Sanxingdui has none. Not a seal, not a character, not a single mark. A society large enough to command this much bronze, this much ivory, this much organized labor, and it wrote down nothing we can read. Later Chinese texts remember a kingdom in this region called Shu, and a first king named Kangkong who was said to have protruding eyes. It is tempting to look at those bulging bronze faces and see him, but that is a legend written centuries afterward. The people who made the masks are silent. Around 3,000 years ago, the settlement was abandoned. Its people appear to have moved a short distance to a site now called Vinča, carrying the same strange style with them. Before that, two faded from view. Between 2020 and 2022, 6 more pits were opened beside the first 2. They held another 17,000 objects, a fragment of a golden mask, threads of silk. The faces keep coming out of the ground. We can hold them, weigh them, date them to the year. We cannot ask them anything. They were made to stare past us, out of a kingdom that never once wrote its own name. Number 9. The Vinca culture. In 1908, a Serbian archaeologist named Miloje Vasic began cutting into a low mound on the banks of the Danube, just outside Belgrade. The mound was a tell, a hill built entirely out of the collapsed remains of houses stacked on houses across thousands of years. What he found under the grass was one of the largest settlements in Neolithic Europe, more than 7,000 years old, full of fine, dark burnished pottery, clay figurines, and some of the earliest copper working anywhere on the continent. The culture it belonged to spread across the Central Balkans, through what is now Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria, roughly between 5,400 and 4,500 years before the Common Era. These were not simple farmers scattered in the woods. Vinca settlements could hold hundreds of houses, laid out in rows, occupied for centuries. Some spread across dozens of hectares and may have held a few thousand people, larger than anything else in Europe at the time. And they had begun to work metal. At sites tied to this culture, archaeologists have found traces of copper smelting from around 7,000 years ago, among the oldest anywhere on Earth. For its moment in prehistory, this was an advanced world. And on the pottery, and on the spindle whorls, and on small clay tablets, there were signs, not pictures of animals or people, marks, straight lines, crosses, combs, zigzags, chevrons, arranged in rows. Over 200 distinct symbols have now been cataloged across more than 150 sites. Most objects carry only a few of them, but the same signs appear again and again in the same forms, over a huge area in a long span of time. Similar marks turn up at related sites across the region, on clay plaques from Gradishnica in Bulgaria, and on a wooden tablet from Despilio in northern Greece. Whatever this was, it was not the invention of one village. It was shared. What makes this hard to put down is a discovery made far to the northeast at a village in Romania called Tartaria. In 1961, an archaeologist named Nicolae Vlasa dug 3 small clay tablets out of a pit, together with a scatter of figurines and the burned remains of a human body. The tablets were covered in rows of the same kind of incised signs. Radiocarbon dates from the surrounding material pointed to somewhere around 5,300 years before the Common Era. If those dates hold, and if those marks are what they appear to be, then symbols were being pressed into clay here more than 1,000 years before the first writing of Sumer. That single word, writing, is where the caution comes in. Most archaeologists do not believe the Vinca signs are a true script that records a language. Vasic himself, the man who first dug them up, called many of the marks potter's signs, ways of tagging a workshop or an owner. They may be exactly that. Tallies, ownership marks, symbols tied to ritual rather than to speech. A few scholars have argued the opposite, that this is an early European writing tradition, older than anything in Mesopotamia, that was simply never continued. Others warn that seeing writing here may be little more than the human habit of finding language in any repeated pattern. The honest position is that we do not know which it is. And that is the strange residue this culture leaves behind. The Vinca people faded around 4500 BCE, absorbed into the cultures that came after them, leaving their tells and their pottery and their 200 silent signs. If those signs are writing, then human beings learned to write in Europe, and then forgot how, and left no one who could read it. If they are not writing, then a symbol system that looks like writing rose across an entire region, was used for centuries, and vanished. Either way, the tablets are still here, and no living person can tell what a single mark on them was meant to say. Number 8. The civilization the desert swallowed. Victor Sarianidi was a Soviet archaeologist who, in 1972, picked up a handful of broken pottery from the surface of a low gray hill in the Karakum Desert of Turkmenistan. The local people called the hill Gonur Dipe, the Gray Hill. There was nothing obvious there, only sand and the ordinary debris of the deep past. Sarianidi kept coming back. He excavated the place, on and off, for the next 40 years, until his death in 2013. And out of that empty desert, he pulled an entire lost civilization. We now call it the Oxus civilization, or by its clumsier name, the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex. It flourished across Central Asia between roughly 2300 and 1700 years before the Common Era, in the delta of a river that has since shifted away. Gonur alone covered around 55 hectares. At its heart stood a walled citadel, 100 meters by 180, surrounded by more walls, towers, gates, water basins, and canals. More than 150 settlements have been found across the delta around it. This was a Bronze Age society ranked by some scholars alongside Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus as one of the great early civilizations of the world. Beside the citadel, Sarianidi uncovered a vast cemetery, more than 3,000 graves packed into a few hectares. Some were rich beyond the ordinary. One held a 4-wheeled wooden wagon with bronze-rimmed wheels, and the skeleton of a horse, dated to around 2,200 years before the Common Era, among the earliest such burials known. The people buried there were laid out with gold and silver, with lapis lazuli carried from the mountains of Afghanistan and carnelian traded up from the Indus. Their metalwork stood level with Egypt's. Their goods moved along the same networks that linked Mesopotamia to the cities of Pakistan. This was not an isolated pocket. It was a hub, and almost no one outside the Soviet Union knew it existed. Sarianidi published mainly in Russian journals. For decades, while textbooks named 4 cradles of Old World civilization, a 5th one sat under the sand of Turkmenistan, unread in the wider world until his work was finally translated in the 1990s. Think about what that means. An entire civilization, with its cities and cemeteries and a religion of its own, sat in the standard histories as a blank. For most of the 20th century, the maps of the ancient world had a hole where it belonged. But here is where it turns difficult. This civilization had seals, hundreds of them, carved with animals and monsters and geometric designs. Some of those seals carry signs that a few researchers think may be an early form of writing. Those signs have never been deciphered, and its people left something even harder to interpret. Sarianidi found rooms he read as temples, built around fire, and he came to believe he was looking at the deep root of Zoroastrianism, the fire religion of ancient Persia. Few archaeologists accept that reading, but something set apart was happening in those rooms. In vessels there, researchers identified the residues of a ritual drink brewed from ephedra, along with traces of hemp and poppy. A society that may have prepared a sacred mind-altering drink in chambers built for it, and carried the habit with them wherever they went. That word extraordinary gets used too easily, but it fits a civilization this large that stayed invisible this long, and it dissolved almost as quietly as it was found. By around 1700 BCE, the Great Walled Compounds were fading, pressed by newcomers from the northern steppe, the delta, drying and shifting. The people did not simply die. Their descendants are folded into the populations of Central Asia today. But the Oxus civilization itself came apart, and here is the detail that lingers. We do not know what these people called their own country. The name they used for the land they built, the 5th civilization, was never recovered. The desert gave us their cities and kept their name. Number 7. The oldest city in the Americas. It was October 1994 when Ruth Shady, a Peruvian archaeologist, first walked into a dry valley north of Lima and stood before what everyone had taken to be a natural hill. Other archaeologists had passed over the Soup Valley for half a century, partly because the site was so barren. There was no pottery lying on the ground. In the standard story of civilization, pottery is a marker of a settled, complex people. Its absence usually means there is nothing here worth the trouble. Shady suspected the opposite. She thought the hills were not hills. They were pyramids. Caral turned out to be a real city, one of 19 settlements packed into that single valley, with a main pyramid rising about 18 meters, sunken circular plazas, residential quarters, and platforms of stone. Among the finds were dozens of flutes carved from the wing bones of condors and pelicans, and knotted strings that some researchers read as an early counting device, a way of keeping records for a people who had no writing at all. To find out how old it was, Shady's team pulled reed, carrying bags, called shikras, out of the pyramid fill. Those reeds were sent to laboratories in Illinois, where 2 American researchers, Jonathan Haas and Winifred Creamer, ran the radiocarbon dates. The results came back around 2,600 years before the Common Era. The findings were published in the journal Science in 2001. Sit with that number. Caral was already a city of stone pyramids, while the Egyptians were building the pyramids at Giza. It is one of only a handful of places on the entire planet where civilization was invented from scratch, on its own, with no older civilization nearby to copy. And it was built by people who had none of the things we usually treat as the foundations of urban life. No pottery, no metal tools, no written language that we can identify, no wheel, no sign of an army. And here's the detail that undoes the whole model. There are no city walls. There are no fortifications. There are no weapons, no mutilated bodies, no ash layers from a siege. Not here, and not anywhere across the wider Norte Chico region. For a century, archaeology told us that fear built the first cities, that people banded together behind stone to survive each other. Caral did not. A society of thousands rose here, with no sign it was ever built for war. What holds a society that size together? Then, without armies, without fortresses, without the constant pressure of attack. The answer Shady reconstructed is quieter than conquest. This was a world built on trade, cotton grown inland and woven into nets, carried down to the coast and exchanged for fish. Inland cities like Caral and coastal towns like Aspero fed each other, one growing the nets, the other filling them from the sea. It was a system organized around exchange rather than bloodshed, thousands of years before the empires that would later dominate the Andes. What finally ended Caral was not an enemy, it was the weather. After centuries, the city was let go. Recent work by Shady points to a long, punishing drought around 2,200 years before the Common Era, part of a climate crisis that struck societies from the Andes to Mesopotamia to China at roughly the same moment. The people of the Supi Valley do not seem to have been slaughtered. They moved, rebuilt elsewhere at sites like Vinča on the coast, and carried their pyramids and their plazas to new ground. What remains is the emptied city. The pyramids still stand in the desert, stripped back to their stone. We can walk their staircases and stand in their sunken courts. We can see, in the reed bags buried in the walls, the hands that stacked them 5,000 years ago. What we cannot see is a single word from the people who built the oldest city in the hemisphere, because as far as we can tell, they never wrote one. Number 6, the Olmec. In 1862, a laborer clearing farmland near Tres Zapotes, in the Mexican state of Veracruz, struck the top of a buried stone. When it was dug out, it was a giant human head carved from a single block of dark volcanic rock, taller than a man, with heavy features and a fitted cap. The man who reported it, Jose Maria Melgar y Serrano, had no framework to explain it. Serious archaeology did not reach these heads until 1938. That year, Matthew Sterling of the Smithsonian, backed by the National Geographic Society, began excavating the Gulf Coast lowlands. He found more heads, along with buried altars, thrones, and offerings of jade. The people who made them are called the Olmec, and they are the oldest complex civilization in Mesoamerica, flourishing from around 1400 to 400 years before the Common Era. Their great center at San Lorenzo was thriving by 1200 BCE. Everything that comes later in the region, the pyramids, the ball game, the calendar traditions, the gods, grows in some way out of what the Olmecs started. They were the mother culture, the root of a world. Their cities were real centers of power. San Lorenzo sat on an artificial plateau raised above the floodplain, laced with drainage lines cut from stone. La Venta, which rose as San Lorenzo fell, held one of the earliest pyramids in Mesoamerica and buried offerings of polished jade, mirrors of iron ore, and mosaic pavements laid down only to be covered over. Their art returns again and again to a strange half-human, half-jaguar figure, snarling, with a cleft head. And at a site nearby, a stone block turned up, carrying rows of incised symbols that some researchers call the oldest writing in the Americas, dated to around 900 years before the Common Era. It, too, has never been read. And then there are the heads themselves. 17 of them are known so far, most from San Lorenzo, and a site called La Venta. They range from about 1.5 meters to over 3 meters tall. The largest weigh in the range of 40 tons. Each was carved from basalt that does not occur where the heads were found. The stone was taken from mountains dozens of kilometers away, then dragged and floated across rivers and swamp to the cities. Moving one head has been estimated to require around 1,500 people, working for 3 to 4 months. They did it with no wheels and no draft animals. Every ton of it was moved by human muscle, over land and along rivers, for the sake of a single carved face. And these are not gods or abstractions. Each head has its own face, its own expression, its own headgear. They are portraits. They are the individual faces of specific rulers, made permanent in stone that had to be hauled across a landscape by an entire population. And then someone destroyed them. Many Olmec monuments, including some of the great heads, were deliberately defaced, broken, drilled with pits, buried, dug up again, and reburied. At San Lorenzo, around 900 years before the Common Era, the center went into decline, and its monuments were smashed and interred in long lines along a ridge. For a long time, this was read as evidence of a violent end, an invasion or an uprising that pulled down the images of the old kings. More recent excavation argues it may be something quieter. These were workshops, the argument goes, where monuments were recarved and reused, thrones reshaped into heads. In a culture where a single boulder of good basalt was worth months of 1,000 lives, nothing that heavy was wasted. The two readings could not be further apart. One is rage, the other is thrift. The honest summary is that we cannot tell them apart, and the events that ended San Lorenzo and later La Venta remain poorly understood. That uncertainty is the haunting part. We are looking at the faces of the first kings in the Americas, and we do not know whether the scars on them were left by their own descendants in reverence, by enemies in rage, or by workmen simply reusing good stone. The civilization faded into the cultures that followed, its cities swallowed by jungle. But the heads outlasted everyone. They outlasted the rulers they portray, and they outlasted whoever it was that tried to deface them. The stone kept the face. It did not keep the reason. Number 5. The Astronomers of the Green Sahara. In 1973, a team of archaeologists driving across the far south of the Egyptian desert stopped in the middle of an empty basin and noticed shaped stones standing in the sand. The team was led by the American archaeologist Fred Wendorf, working for years alongside the Polish scholar Romuald Schild. The place is called Nabta Playa, about 100 kilometers west of the Nile, near the modern border with Sudan. Today, it is one of the most lifeless places on Earth, a floor of cracked sediment under an enormous sky. But it was not always a desert. 10,000 years ago, the Sahara was green. For several thousand years, a period geologists call the African humid period, the monsoon reached far north. Seasonal rains filled shallow lakes, and grass grew where there is now only sand. People gathered wild sorghum and millet and dug wells to reach water through the dry months. Cattle herders moved across this landscape from lake to lake, the way sailors move between islands. At Nabta Playa, they left behind something remarkable. They buried whole cattle in stone-lined chambers under mounds of earth. When Wendorf's team opened the central tomb hoping to find a human burial, they instead found the bones of a cow and a large stone that appears to have been shaped into the form of a cow. These people did not just herd cattle. They seem to have worshipped them, more than 2,000 years before the cattle gods of ancient Egypt, and they raised stones to the sky. Nabta Playa holds lines of standing megaliths and a small circle of upright slabs, only about 4 meters across, with narrow gaps in it like sightlines. The excavators argued that 2 of those sightlines point north and toward the rising sun at the summer solstice, the moment the rains were due. If they are right, this little ring of desert stones may be among the oldest astronomical devices ever built by human beings. What makes Nabta Playa particularly unsettling is not the stones themselves. It is the timeline those stones force us to accept. The chronology is astonishing, and the meaning is disputed, and both are true at once. Consider the age. The megalithic building here belongs to a world older than almost anything we can name. It was older than the pyramids of Egypt by well over 1,000 years. It was older than Stonehenge. It was raised by nomads with no cities, no metal, and no writing, in a place that has since become a dead basin. At the same time, the astronomy is argued over. The excavators, Wendorf and the astronomer J. McKim Malville, proposed that lines of megaliths were aimed at bright stars like Sirius as they rose thousands of years ago, and that the little circle marked the solstice. Other researchers have pushed back hard on the exact dates and the exact stars, and a few wilder claims that the arrangement encodes the distances to those stars have been examined and dismissed as reading modern astronomy into ancient rock. Strip all of that away, and the careful version is still enough. People with no cities, no metal, and no writing were lining up stones with the sky, thousands of years before the first pharaoh. Then the world changed. Around 7,000 years ago, the monsoon belt drifted south. The lakes dried, the grass died, and the people of the Green Sahara had to leave the land they had marked with stone and buried cattle in. Some archaeologists suspect they moved toward the Nile, carrying with them a reverence for cattle and a habit of watching the sky that reappears centuries later in the religion of pharaonic Egypt. That connection is a hypothesis, not a certainty. What is certain is the emptiness. The stones still stand in the sand, aligned to a sunrise that no one there is left to watch. We do not know exactly who these people were, and the desert that erased their world will not give them back. Number 4. Liangzhu. In 1936, a young Chinese archaeologist named Shi Xingung began digging near the town of Liangzhu in the Yangtze Delta south of Shanghai. He turned up black pottery and finally worked stone, pieces that reminded him of finds from his own hometown. He had no idea he was standing on the edge of a 5,000-year-old state. The full scale of the place became clear only over the following decades. What lay buried there was a walled city of around 300 hectares, with palace foundations, altars, and one of the most sophisticated engineering achievements of the ancient world. Liangzhu built with water. Around the city, its people built a network of high dams and low dams, canals and reservoirs. More than 100 separate structures. They held back the summer floods, stored water through the dry season, and carried goods by boat. This is, as far as anyone has found, the oldest large-scale water management system on the planet, in place more than 5,000 years ago. Behind these defenses, they grew rice on an enormous scale, enough to feed a walled capital ringed by earthen ramparts wider than a modern road. And their elite were buried with jade. Tens of thousands of finely carved pieces, squared tubes, and flat discs. Each was cut with a repeating face, part human, part beast, in lines so fine that some are hard to see with the naked eye. That jade was not decoration. It marked rank, and it carried a religion. They did all of this city, these dams, this jade, without a single metal tool. Liangzhu was a Stone Age society operating at the level of an early state. The dams ran for kilometers across the landscape, and the reservoir behind the high ones could have held back a lake. All of it was raised by hand, with baskets of earth and stone, without draft animals or a single metal edge. In 2019, the whole complex was named a World Heritage Site, recognized as evidence that organized society in China reaches back 5,000 years. The water they had spent centuries controlling turned on them. Around 2,300 years before the Common Era, after roughly 1,000 years of life, the city was abandoned, and the people never came back. For a long time, the reason was a mystery, argued over as war or disease or famine or invasion. In 2021, a team of geologists and climate researchers settled a large part of it. They read the record locked inside stalagmites in nearby caves, layer by layer, the way tree rings are read. What they found was a short, violent span of exceptionally heavy monsoon rain, dated to between roughly 4,300 and 4,350 years ago. The rivers rose beyond anything the dams were built for, and across the excavated ruins, a layer of flood silt caps the last Liangzhu levels, sealing the end of the culture like a lid pressed down over it. That is the disturbing shape of it. This was one of the most flood-conscious societies that had ever existed. Its entire genius was the management of water, its dams, its reservoirs, its raised city. Everything it had built over 1,000 years was an argument against the river, and the river won. The fields were buried, the canals overwhelmed, the whole delta drowned by exactly the force the civilization had organized itself to resist. The people scattered into the surrounding lands, folding into the cultures that came after them along the Yangtze. The jade survived. It was passed down and imitated for thousands of years, its motifs echoing through later Chinese art long after anyone remembered where they came from. A symbol first cut into stone by a drowned civilization kept turning up in the hands of people who had never heard its name. But the closing image is not the jade, it is the water. The rivers that flooded Liangzhu are still there, still fed by the same monsoon, running through one of the most densely populated regions on Earth. The system that unmade the oldest water civilization in the world never went anywhere. It is still flowing, and it is still capable of the same thing. Number 3. The Minoans. Around 3,600 years ago, on an island in the Aegean Sea, a volcano begins to come apart. The island is now called Santorini. In the ancient world, it was Thera. The eruption is one of the largest the planet has produced in the last several thousand years. It threw many cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the atmosphere and blasted the center out of the island, leaving the ring of cliffs that tourists photograph today. Ash climbs miles into the sky. A town on the island, a place we call Akrotiri, is buried alive under meters of pumice and volcanic dust. Its streets and staircases and painted walls sealed the way Pompeii would be sealed 15 centuries later. And then, the sea moves. Tsunamis race outward across the Aegean toward the north coast of a much larger island, 70 miles away, where the heart of a civilization sits close to the water. That civilization is the Minoan world of Crete, the first true civilization of Europe. We know it largely through one man. In 1900, the British archaeologist Arthur Evans began excavating a vast building complex at Knossos and named the culture after Minos, the king from Greek legend. What Evans uncovered was staggering. Multi-story palaces, running water, drainage, storerooms lined with giant jars, and walls painted with dolphins, bulls, and women in bright dress. Knossos was only the largest of them. There were palace centers across Crete, at Phaistos, at Malea, at Zakros on the eastern coast. This was a sophisticated maritime power, more than 1,000 years before classical Greece, trading across the eastern Mediterranean, at its height, perhaps 20,000 people strong in a single center. And there is a detail at Akrotiri that deepens the strangeness. When the buried town was excavated, almost no human bodies were found, and little gold. It looks as though the people felt the warning tremors and fled, leaving their frescoed rooms behind them, and where they went is unknown. But here is where the mystery deepens, because for all their sophistication, the Minoans cannot speak to us. They wrote. They kept records in 2 scripts, an early set of hieroglyphs, and a later system we call Linear A. Neither has ever been deciphered. A related later script, Linear B, was cracked in 1952 by a young English architect named Michael Ventris, working with the scholar John Chadwick. It turned out to record an early form of Greek, the language of the mainland Mycenaeans who came after. That decipherment worked because Linear B wrote a language we already knew. Linear A does not. It carries the Minoans' own tongue, and there is no second version in a known language to hold it against. No key. So it remains locked. We can read their account books in the sense that we can see the shapes. We cannot understand a word. So we are left interpreting a catastrophe with half the evidence missing. The Thera eruption did not by itself end the Minoans. Its exact date is still argued, somewhere around 1600 BCE by the radiocarbon evidence, and Crete lies far enough away that the island civilization survived the blast and the waves. But something was fatally weakened. Within a century or two, the palaces were burning, and it was the mainland Mycenaeans, not the volcano, who ended up ruling Crete. The most careful reading is that the eruption damaged the trade and the fleet and the confidence of a sea power, and that rivals moved into the gap. It is a nightmarish sequence to reconstruct: an eruption, a buried town, a weakened kingdom, an absorption. And the Minoans did not exactly vanish. They were folded into the Greek world that followed. Their art, their sea, their labyrinth survive as the deep foundation under later Greece, and the volcano that broke them may itself have become the seed of a legend. The story Plato would one day tell about a great island power swallowed by the sea. But the people themselves slipped out of reach. Their frescoes still show us their faces, their leaping bulls, their fashions. Their tablets still carry their words, and their language sits there in front of us, in their own hand, saying something we will probably never hear. Number 2, the largest towns of the ancient world. The houses were burned on purpose. That is the fact that everything about this civilization has to be measured against. So it is worth stating plainly before anything else. For more than 1,000 years, in the forest steppe of what is now Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania, people built enormous settlements and then set them on fire. The culture is called Cucuteni-Trypillia. It is named after two places, a village in Romania, where painted pottery was found in 1884, and a village near Kiev, where the Ukrainian archaeologist Vicente dug in the 1890s. It existed from roughly 5,500 to 2,700 years before the Common Era. That name means little to most people, which is part of what is strange here, because these were, for a time, the largest human settlements anywhere on Earth. For decades, they were dismissed as scattered villages. It was only in the last 20 years that the true picture appeared. Archaeologists flew magnetic sensors over the black soil of central Ukraine. What showed up was the outline of thousands of houses, buried in the fields. The megasites are the ones that break the scale. At Talyanki, the surveys map an area of around 450 hectares, holding up to 2,700 houses. At Maidanetsky, the buried remains of roughly 2,300 structures have been detected. Population estimates for these places run into the thousands, and at the upper end, into the tens of thousands. That is larger than Uruk, the great early city of Mesopotamia, and older, and they were laid out with a striking, deliberate order. Rings of houses, circle inside circle, arranged around a wide, empty center. Larger communal buildings stood among them. It looks like a plan held in a single mind. The truly unsettling part is what they did with those houses. Across this culture, the great majority of the buildings show signs of intense, deliberate burning. The clay of the walls was fired so hot that it slagged and warped, turned almost to glass. Clay does not reach that temperature in an ordinary house fire. To do it, they had to pack the buildings with extra fuel and set them alight on purpose. And it was not one disaster, one bad night. It happened again and again, house after house, settlement after settlement, generation after generation, for the entire life of the culture. The leading interpretation is that the burning was a rite, a way of closing a house, or an entire town, at the end of its span before raising a new one, perhaps every few decades. Some researchers point out that all that burning would have consumed staggering amounts of timber. They wonder whether the people were slowly stripping their own forests bare. But the belief underneath it, the thing that made an entire civilization commit its own homes to the fire on a regular cycle, is not recorded and not understood. So we are left with a real question, and not a rhetorical one. Why would people build the largest settlements on the planet, plan them down to concentric rings, fill them with thousands of families, and then, over and over, for 1,000 years, burn them to the ground? We can describe it precisely. We can date it, map it, measure the heat that warped the clay. We cannot say what it meant to them. And then, after around 3,500 BCE, the megasites emptied. Not slowly. The great planned settlements were depopulated within a few generations, and the culture that built them dispersed and dissolved into the peoples who came after. Something shifted. Maybe the climate turned. Maybe the soil wore out. Maybe herders from the eastern steppe pressed into the region. Or maybe the whole way of living together at that scale simply stopped working. We can list the possibilities. We cannot say which one closed the door. They left no writing to explain the building, no writing to explain the burning, and no writing to explain the leaving. The clay is still in the ground, baked hard by their own fires. Instruments can now trace the outline of every vanished house, across fields where crops grow today. What is gone is the thing that connected them, the belief that made the largest towns in the world worth raising and worth burning on a schedule. Whatever that idea was, it went into the fire with the last of the houses, and no one wrote it down. Number 1. The Indus Valley. In 1921 and 1922, two men working more than 400 miles apart began uncovering the same impossible thing. Daya Ram Sani was digging at a place called Harappa in the Punjab. Rakaldas Banerjee was digging at a place called Mohenjo-Daro, far to the south along the Indus in Sindh. Both worked under the direction of John Marshall, who in 1924 announced to the world that these were not two isolated ruins, but the twin cities of a single, forgotten civilization, older than anything then known in the subcontinent. They had, without realizing it at first, walked into the largest civilization of the ancient world. The scale is difficult to hold in the mind. The Indus, or Harappan civilization, reached its height between about 2600 and 1900 years before the Common Era, and it stretched across more than 1 million square kilometers, a greater expanse than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. More than 1,000 settlements have been found across it. Mohenjo-Daro alone may have held as many as 40,000 people, and these were not chaotic organic towns. They were planned. Streets laid out on a grid, houses of standardized fired brick, 2 stories tall, many with private wells and bathrooms, covered drains running along the streets, carrying waste out of the city. A sanitation system in ordinary homes that much of the world would not match again for thousands of years. At the center of Mohenjo-Daro, they built a great watertight pool of fitted brick sealed with tar, a public bath the size of a small swimming pool, its purpose still argued over. And their weights were standardized, a graded set of cut stone cubes that follow the same measures from one end of the civilization to the other, hundreds of miles apart, so that grain weighed in one city would weigh the same in another. And this is where the Indus becomes stranger than just large. Walk through what we have dug up, and something is missing. There are no great palaces we can point to and say, a king lived here. There are no royal tombs stuffed with gold, no monuments raised to a named conqueror, no carvings of rulers trampling their enemies, no depictions of armies at all. Egypt gives us pharaohs and their names. Mesopotamia gives us kings and their wars. The Indus gives us clean cities of 1 million people, standardized down to the weights they use to measure grain, and almost no sign of the rulers who must have coordinated it. A civilization this organized, and we cannot clearly see who was in charge. And we cannot ask, because we cannot read them. The Indus people wrote. They left a script on thousands of seals and tablets, more than 400 distinct signs. But the inscriptions are tiny, only a few signs each, with no long texts and no bilingual key to crack them against. For 100 years, some of the best minds available have tried. The Indus script has not been deciphered. We do not know what language it recorded. We do not even know what these people called themselves. The name we use, Indus, is the name of a river. Their own name for their own civilization is simply gone. So what happened to them? For a long time, the story was violence, an invasion that put the cities to the sword. That story has fallen apart. The evidence now points somewhere quieter and, in a way, larger. Around 1900 BCE, the climate shifted. The monsoon that watered the region weakened and moved. One of the great river systems that fed the civilization, the Ghaggar Hakra, that some identify with the lost Sarasvati of later memory, dried and shifted its course. A study led by the geologist Liangzhu Gyosun, published in 2012, traced how these changes pulled the ground out from under the cities. There was no single day of destruction. Over generations, the water became unreliable. The cities emptied, and the people drifted east and broke apart into smaller villages. Urban life, the standardized bricks, the grid, the drains, the writing, simply stopped. But the people did not die out. This is the part that reaches all the way to the present. Ancient DNA recovered from a Harappan skeleton at the site of Rocky Garhi, published in 2019, showed that these were, in large measure, the ancestors of the people who live across South Asia today. Something close to 1/5 of the human species carries their inheritance in its blood. If you have roots in the subcontinent, some of that ancient city is almost certainly yours. The civilization dissolved. The population never did. Its descendants number in the hundreds of millions, and almost none of them know the name of the world their ancestors built, because that name was written in a script no one alive can read. That is the haunting part, and it makes the Indus the deepest silence of them all. This was not a small kingdom, or a strange cult in the desert. It was a civilization of over 1 million people, cleaner and more orderly than most that came after it, and it managed to disappear so completely that we cannot name it, cannot read it, and cannot say for certain how it ended. The seals survive, stamped with their signs. The cities survive, swept and drained. The people survive, walking through the modern subcontinent by the hundreds of millions. And between the seals we cannot read and the descendants who do not know, an entire civilization sits in plain sight, still waiting for someone to hear a single word of what it was trying to say. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.